jumping in to determining your search needs. As I said, this is pretty individual, and there are a couple of things to sort of think about as you're determining your search needs. And the first is your research question. How broad or how narrow is your research question? Is it interdisciplinary? Is it multidisciplinary? Or is it very specifically in one subject area? And all of these things will help you decide where you need to go to search. I'm going to give you some examples here. This first sample research question: are there differences in the odds of cardiovascular disease factors and cardiovascular disease diagnoses between sexual minority and heterosexual adults? Thinking through this, we've got a very specific population, sexual minorities who have, cardiovascular disease risk factors and diagnoses. This is going to be pretty multidisciplinary because we're going to need to look in the medical literature for that cardiovascular disease piece. We're also going to want to look in some literature specifically geared for that sexual minority population. And that is a little bit different from this second research question: is immobilization more beneficial or more harmful compared with early movement protocols for acute lateral ankle ligament injuries? So that's a very specific medical sports injury kind of a question. And so we won't necessarily need to look in any population specific databases for that. We're going to look in the medical literature. We're going to look in the kinesiology and health education literature. So that's why it's really helpful to think in terms of your specific research question. And then the second factor is what type of review. And yes, we're focusing on systematic reviews specifically in this workshop, but if you are doing a scoping review, if you are doing an umbrella review, you're not necessarily going to look in the same places for literature that you will for a systematic review. So for a scoping review, you're going to be much more focused on sort of everything. Gray literature is going to be hugely important for those scoping reviews because you're trying to get an idea of not only what's published, but what's not published in this topic. For systematic reviews, gray literature is still important, but it's not as big a piece of the puzzle as it would be with scoping reviews. And then with umbrella reviews, you're looking at published systematic reviews or published scoping reviews. And so there's specific places that you go to search for those, and it wouldn't necessarily be the same search in the databases that you would do for a systematic review. So those are sort of ways of thinking about it. A third factor, and actually the third and fourth factor sort of go in together, right? Your timeline. Do you have time to search exhaustively through a bunch of databases? Or do you need to truncate that a little bit? And do you have enough authors to search in all of those databases? And when we talk a little bit more about how to find databases specifically that we don't have access to here at UT, do you need to add an author from another institution that has access to those databases? So timeline is more important in certain disciplines for your systematic review than others. I know there are disciplines where you can, knock out a publishable systematic review in 6 months with one or a few reviewers or authors on that. That is not the case in most disciplines. And so think about your discipline too. In like the medical fields and the health sciences, you're going to want to have a year and 3+ authors to do a real full systematic review. And so if you don't have that timeline and that amount of authors, you might want to think about doing a systematized review. And that's something I think we've talked about a little bit in previous workshops. And that's something that librarians are really happy to talk with you about as well. So another factor is publisher expectations or norms. One of the things that I like to ask even before I meet with somebody to talk about conducting a systematic review is, where do you intend to publish? Do you have a target journal? Are you planning to publish with Cochrane? Because it's really helpful to know in advance what their expectations are going to be so that you can build those expectations and those norms in throughout the process. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of an example on that. So what you'll want to do is check first do they even publish systematic reviews? Because not all journals are going to publish systematic reviews. And then if you've got a scoping review, not all journals are going to publish scoping reviews. And so if you don't see that information specifically on the journal's website, it may be worth an email to that journal saying, hey, this is a project I have in mind. Do you publish systematic or scoping reviews? So that you know right off the bat and you're not wasting your time trying to submit to a journal that's not going to accept it. And then, is there a word limit? And this has come up with a number of systematic and scoping reviews that I've worked with, is different journals are going to have different word limits. And sometimes the word limits are different for systematic reviews than they are for those articles. So you'll want to know up front what those sort of word limits are. And is there a limit for the number of references that you can include? That's another thing that has come up with systematic reviews that I've worked with, is they'll only allow a certain number of references. And if you're doing all of your references for your introductory part of it and like all of these other things, and then your included articles as well, sometimes you can be pushing those limits. 4, so do they require a registered protocol? For your health sciences disciplines, the answer is going to be almost always yes, but that won't necessarily be the case for some other disciplines. So that's another thing to check. It should be on the journal's website. And then sort of take a look at the systematic reviews that they've published in the past. Are they similar enough in topic to what you're working on that it feels like they would be a good fit? And this is something they're interested in. This is something that they've published on in the past. And then go through and look at the methods section of a few of those similar systematic reviews that they've published in the past. And then what that does is that can tell you, oh, there's certain databases that all of these are using and they get published in this journal. So maybe I need to think about using those databases as well. And so I'm going to give you an example of one that I was recently working with, the American Journal of Public Health. I was able to find on their website, they do accept systematic reviews. They do have a different word limit for systematic reviews than other articles. So there's a 4,000 word limit. And then they do have a 60 reference limit as well. And so that's a good thing to sort of be aware of. And then they do specifically say that they recommend that you register your protocol in Prospero. Registering it is required. And the fact that they recommend Prospero makes me think, okay, I'm going to go ahead and do that and not worry about looking at any other places for registering this protocol. So that gives me sort of a lot of information up front of what I need to do. And that's one of those things. It's like, that's why I want to know this up front before I put together my protocol. So then that 5th question, will your systematic review be a good fit for this particular journal? And so then going back and thinking about the research question samples from a couple of slides ago, so the cardiovascular risk and disease in sexual minority populations, because this is a public health journal, and I went and searched through the last 10 systematic reviews that were published in this journal, I can see that, yes, this is going to be a good fit for this journal. Whereas my ankle injuries, that second research question, not so much. And so then I can say, okay, so this particular research question is probably not a good fit for this journal. So I'm going to look at maybe a different journal. And then going through that, how thorough are the research methods sections in their published systematic reviews, and then that consistency in the databases used. I just sort of went through those first 10 or whatever systematic reviews, and I saw Medline was in at least 4 of them. PsycInfo was the second most used, Web of Science, PubMed, CINAHL, and Embase. And so those are things that I can just sort of have in my notes of like places that I want to check if I'm able to. And then I would say that this is also a good point to sort of ask a librarian as well, because like a librarian can tell you that PubMed includes Medline as well. And so you don't necessarily need to do both of those searches, but you wouldn't necessarily know that unless you talked to a librarian. So another plug for librarians, we can be helpful in choosing where to search for these databases.